Hello, readers. This is Justin's 52 Books, where I discuss my selections for the 52 Book Club's Reading Challenge. And I have now finished the 2022 Reading Challenge year. And I thought I'd wind up the year with a kind of a breakdown of my best and least favorite books for my 2022 Reading Challenge selections. And we're going to start with Best Fiction. First book I want to highlight was Goliath by Tochi Onyebuchi. Onyebuchi has this ability to whittle down science fiction tropes into spear points and use them for new and important purposes. And in Goliath, he kind of calls to mind, for me at least, John Brunner and John Brunner's book, The Sheep Look Up, with subject matter about racial prejudice and gentrification and class entitlement, rather than Brunner's book about environmental doom and existential death. Goliath is a really, really good book and really good science fiction, and a step forward for, I would say, the genre of science fiction altogether. Great book. Next up was Devil House by John Darnielle of Mountain Goats fame. Metafiction asking the question, who owns a true story when the story is written and released and published as a book? Is it the storyteller or the people who lived it? I think a lot about this book, and I think anyone who thinks about how books are written or how stories get propelled through culture has a lot to like in this book. Also recommended on audiobook. I got the physical book here, but I listened to it on audio, and Darnielle does the audiobook for it, and the way he does it, particularly for some of the voices, is very interesting in what it means for the book, and does it have the same meaning in written word, and creates even more questions about metafiction and books about books. Really liked it. It looks, with the title font and the title, it looks like old 80s horror. Doesn't have much to do with 80s horror or Satanic Panic or any of that kind of thing. Just a really good book about books. And that brings me to my favorite book of 2022. That would be The Trees by Percival Everett. Everett always delivers and really writes books that need to be written, and really did that with The Trees. Buddy cop comedy / epitaph of horror / actual horror book. All of those things wrapped together make this my favorite of 2022. It was weird because it nominated for a Booker Award after I read it. I don't really follow the Booker Awards all that much. I don't really swim in those waters much, but I'm a reader, so my social media brings me news about books and awards and all that kind of thing. And so it was weird to have a horse in the Booker Prize race this year, and to be, be a fan of one of those authors. That doesn't usually happen for me, but didn't win the Booker Award, and maybe that's not such a bad thing, because that means more Percival Everett trying to get that Booker Award, and more Percival Everett is a good thing to me, at least. So, best book of 2022 as far as I'm concerned. That brings me to least favorite. Least favorite book that I read in 2022, at least for the reading challenge, would be Persephone Station by Stina Licht. And I'm being a little unfair by saying it's the least favorite. Least favorite fiction, sure. It's not a bad book. I don't want to say that it was. It certainly didn't suck. Let's say that. But it wasn't great, and it wasn't good, and there wasn't much new or anything new that I really saw. And it just really wasn't for me. And hey, maybe it wasn't written for me, and I get that. But I don't really see a whole lot in that book to recommend it. Would I take it out of my kids' hands if I saw them reading it? And hey, this is a science fiction book. Absolutely not. No, it's fine. Ultimately, maybe I'm just not a fan of main characters with snarky and overconfident inner voices, and that's a trend in science fiction right now. And maybe just fiction altogether. I wasn't a fan of Gideon the Ninth, and I know that was quality, but it's still not a book for me. I get it. I'm okay with books not being for me, but it's my list. Least favorite fiction, definitely least favorite science fiction this year. And then, along with that, a collection, The Ultimate Threshold, a collection of the finest in Soviet science fiction, edited by and translated by Mira Ginsburg. Wasn't a fan of this either. A few years ago, I read a book about Soviet era science called Stalin and the Scientists by Simon Ings. And it's very fortunate that I read that, because I wouldn't even know where to begin with this if I hadn't read that, and I didn't understand that all these scientists and engineers that are writing these stories were Soviet scientists and engineers on real science projects. And hey, that happens in the United States too. That's not a Soviet thing. That's just a science and science fiction thing. They've always gone together. That's why we have science fiction. But that has always been a criticism of science fiction as well, that it seems like it's written by engineers and scientists. And that is really the case with The Ultimate Threshold. Vaguely interesting ideas written by a robot and edited for a science journal is really what all these stories are. Most of the stories are about as good as a mediocre to bad Twilight Zone episode. Not great. That brings me to my favorite nonfiction. Good year for nonfiction for me, or at least my reads. First off, I'd like to discuss Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and The Making of a Masterpiece by Michael Benson. Love this book. Love that it got me to do a deep dive on the book 2001: Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. I'd never read that. The movie, I had, is a cultural reference, so everyone knows a little bit about 2001: A Space Odyssey, the movie. But it was good to have a book kind of guide me through that. It says in a book, it says an awful lot about a movie when you have to read two books to understand it. But I did walk away with a real appreciation for the movie, for this book, and for Arthur C. Clarke's work as well. I would almost say I understand it now. So, moving forward with favorite nonfiction, The History of Science Fiction by Xavier Dallo and Jabril Morset-Fan. Loved this book, and it's not perfect. I think there's some translation issues, and I wonder if they go off the rails a little bit with the graphic novel thing, which is great. It's good to have art, but it's nonfiction, so I need to understand what you're doing sometimes, and I didn't always understand what was going on the page, which is fine, but transferring of knowledge gets stopped at that point. But there's a lot about this book that I liked, and in fact, at one point it's got Judith Merril, who was a leading light of science fiction in the 60s. She's a great editor, pretty good pulp fiction writer, pulp science fiction writer, and it has Judith Merril explaining to H.G. Wells both what the new wave of science fiction meant and then the advent of female written science fiction. And that made this book overcome any limitations by its structure or translation or anything like that. In fact, the book has inspired me to tackle my 2023 52 Book Club reading challenge with only female science fiction authors and maybe adjacent genres as well. So big deal book for me. It's kind of sending me down a rabbit hole for the entirety of 2023. Loved The History of Science Fiction. And last, I Am Not a Number by Alex Cox, Decoding the Prisoner. I'd like to highlight this one as well. Middle of summer, I fell into a pretty big reading hole, and I read anything I could get my hands on about the television show The Prisoner. And I was lucky that Alex Cox had just released this a couple years ago. It's a short and sweet overview and analysis with his take on what that show means and meant. And it really says a lot about a television show or anything. That here we are 50 years later, and we're still talking about it and still reading new ideas about it. I love that people keep on having fresh takes on that television show, and I loved Cox's insights. So, last of my favorite nonfiction for 2022. And that brings me to my least favorite nonfiction for 2022, and I'll start with The Anthropocene Reviewed. Have you ever had a situation where you didn't really like something and everyone was like, what the hell is wrong with you? Well, that's me with pretty much John Green altogether. I stuck with it for the trivia, which is good. But the tone, the delivery, and the starred reviews all just rubbed off as being kind of trite and belittling to the subject matter, even though the subject matter is Diet Dr. Pepper or the origin of Piggly Wiggly or whatever. There's a lot in the book to chew on, and some interesting things I actually took away that meant a lot to me, but I still didn't care for it, and maybe it's just John Green. I don't really listen to his podcast, so maybe it's all like that, and it's not for me. Don't know, but not my favorite. Next up, as far as least favorite nonfiction, was Maximum City Bombay, Lost and Found by Sakado Mehta. I'm not sure if it's the fact that this book is pushing 20 years old, maybe it's not as topical as it used to be, or that there are just a lot of issues that Mumbai, Bombay have that are just city problems, and I got my own city to worry about. But Maximum City was kind of a miss for me. Mehta's approach was to embed himself in with his subject matter, kind of gonzo Hunter S. Thompson style, and it just didn't work for me because, well, for better or for worse, Hunter S. Thompson's interesting and Mehta wasn't as much. So yeah, big old miss for me. If this would have been 100 pages about insight on what it's like to move from the United States to India, which it starts out as, I would have been all about it. I'd be probably talking about how this is my favorite book. But it's not 100 pages, it's 500 pages about city stuff. It's fine. It wasn't what I needed to read right at that moment. And speaking of which, my least favorite book of the entire year, Earning the Rockies by Robert Kaplan. A lot of people think, and I agree with them, that Revenge of Geography by Kaplan was wonderful and insightful, and this is not that. This is a travel log about driving from coast to coast, looking for stereotypes that are out there and finding them and reporting on them as if they were the whole and true story. Basically like a taxi cab, journalism from the back of a taxi cab kind of thing. This seemed like, at best, it was nostalgia-driven lib-shaming, and at worst, reactive blame for the 2016 election on all you dummies who didn't see that coming. Which came off to me as retroactive blame for the Trump ascendancy on the establishment elite. I got news for Robert Kaplan. He is the elite. He has access to all these people. He is the elite. I was not a fan of this book, and I am really disappointed that the author of this great book, Revenge of Geography, put out this book, Earning the Rockies, which had absolutely nothing to do with the Rockies or geography, and not that much to do with the truth. On to biggest surprise of the year, that book that I really wasn't looking for and didn't see coming, and just kind of picked up off the shelf and said, oh, that looks cool, and went with it. Biggest surprise was Reverse Colonization, Science Fiction, Imperial Fantasy, and Alt Victimhood by David Higgins. Really enjoyed this book. Really, I'm looking forward to other books from the New American Canon series from the University of Iowa Press. I was surprised to enjoy a textbook on literary criticism as much as I did, but I suppose it was kind of made for people like me. It has essays investigating literary overtones of colonization and the meaning of cultural power dynamics in books like War of the Worlds, Stranger in a Strange Land, Dune, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Man in the High Castle, The Exegesis of Philip K. Dick, Thomas Dish's Prisoner novelization, which actually is the starting point for the whole deep dive I did during the spring about The Prisoner, which led me to a bunch of other books I read this year. Another book that Thomas Dish wrote, was Camp Concentration. It talks about camp concentration, talks about Moorcock's Elric books, and the Fall of the Towers books by Samuel R. Delany. Read this in January last year, and it just was an excellent way to start off the new year, and an important lens to evaluate my reading through. So thank you for David M. Higgins. This was a total surprise for me, and I loved it. And with that, I'm going to get myself into even more trouble with books I ought to have liked and didn't, with the biggest letdown category. And I got 2 books for that, and they're kind of the same thing. And yeah, people love these books. Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, and The Overstory by Richard Powers. There's something about literary writers writing ostensibly science fiction, only the big boy, big girl version that it's okay for literary people to like. And something about that just kind of bugs me. I'm not opposed to it. I'm not opposed to the big boy writers coming in and putting down some science fiction, but when they do that, I got big expectations. Like, if I love science fiction written by pretty okay writers, I should love science fiction written by wonderful writers. And they are wonderful writers who write incredibly well and incredibly heartfelt books. I loved Ishiguro's Remains of the Day. And I loved parts of Clara and the Sun, kind of highlighting the idea of how we learn things. I got children, and I watch how they learn things, and the connections they make, and the assumptions that we all have to make in order to survive and learn things. But at the same time, my expectations for these books was really high, and I don't feel like they delivered on what I wanted them to deliver on. The revelations in both are probably, or perhaps, a little too subtle. And that's fair, but like I said, it means it's a little bit of a letdown for me. Good books, not as good as I had hoped for. And I had assumed that they were going to be great. I acknowledge that's unfair, but it's still a letdown. So biggest letdowns for me. And that brings me to my last category, which I just kind of made up in order to talk about authors I want to talk about and that I think need to be talked about more. So I made this out of nowhere blast from the past author. First off is Robert Sheckley. Read Untouched by Human Hands. I'm going to be reading Pilgrimage to Earth here in a little bit. And I read Dimension of Miracles last year. And through all of those, I'm just surprised by how good Sheckley is at this science fiction comedy. It's this science fiction glibness without sarcasm. It's really hard to do. If you're going to be glib, and science fiction is supposedly smart, and if you're smart, it's hard to not come off as condescending or sarcastic. And Sheckley had a real knack for that kind of humor, and I wish he got more credit for it. Douglas Adams always gets the nod when we talk about funny science fiction. Connie Willis, I would argue, needs more credit in that category as well. And then there's Robert Sheckley, who I feel needs the most improvement in notoriety when it comes to science fiction and humorous science fiction. And Byfield as well. Barbara Nin Byfield on the fantasy side. Really humorous takes on old fantasy, and I wish she got more credit. With the resurgence of interest in Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games, I wish more people knew how much stuff the old Dungeons & Dragons guys, Gygax and Aronson, I wish they understood how much they was swiped from Byfield for those first couple of source books. If you've ever had a passing interest in fantasy fiction or role-playing games, please, please, please check out The Book of the Weird, or what it was published as first, called The Glass Harmonica, although that's kind of hard to find. It and Byfield are wonderful, and I wanted to highlight them as out-of-nowhere blast from the past authors. And that's it for my 2022 categories. I hope you all enjoyed the books that you read for 2022. I know I enjoyed most of what I read, and I'm glad I read all of them, even the ones I didn't like so much. I hope to see you all next week or the week after, or whenever I start posting videos for 2023. Gonna try to keep up with 2023 Reading Challenge, weekly videos for the 2023 Reading Challenge as I'm going through all science fiction and all female authors for my 2023 52 Book Club Reading Challenge this next year, excuse me. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, happy reading.